writing objectives and how to better write these objectives, not just because we want to make you suffer, right? That is something else that you do, but it will ease your work in terms of assessment, right? Because assessment is a big thing. So we're going to talk about rubrics and assessment. It doesn't mean that you need a rubric for everything, but it means that maybe you need to have specific ways of assessment. So when you need the rubric, it's going to be a lot easier to do. And then we are going to talk a little bit about the next face-to-face workshop that you're going to have with Dr. Langman, Juliet Langman, and with Dr. Kristen Lindell, both who you met last time face-to-face. And then we have a little bit of homework, but don't worry, it's not as big as the homework that we had you. It's just a little bit of a reflection that I want you to do. So welcome. This will be 60 minutes. Well, now it's like 50 minutes. But we will be together, and please, to share the first part, I would like you to use your microphones because I want you to share. It's just a few of you, so I guess we could all take turns to say what worked in your lesson plan, what didn't work, and what would you change, and how would you change it. So be very brief. Just tell us what your lesson plan was about, what worked, what didn't work, and what you changed. You can see that from your reflection or from, something that you remember. So how about we go down the list? I know some people don't have microphones, so maybe let's go with somebody who can have a microphone, who has a microphone and who can talk. So I know, Elise, you had said something. Could you please start? I know. You're the first one that I see there.
Okay. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes. Who's this?
Okay. My lesson was actually delivering the PD for instructors.
Oh, yes. Yes. How did that go? Yes.
And so Carlos is one of the instructors that was present during that session. And we have lots of initiatives that we share with the teachers. And so this one was just one of them. And so I had about an hour to share the backwards design. Luckily, we had already done the backwards design last year, so this was a review. Okay. And we had already talked about differentiated instruction. We were already familiar with using a lesson plan template. They just weren't familiar with this one. So I think it kind of worked well. What was new for everyone was probably reviewing again having two objectives, one for the high-level learners, one for the low-level learners, and then always tying in the standards to the assessment to the goal, having that alignment. There were some folks that did struggle with the assessment at the end of the lesson. They do have an assessment maybe at the end of the week, but it's kind of hard to commit to an assessment at the end of the lesson, whether that be a 45-minute period or a 2-hour period. And so after that session, I was able, although I didn't have a physical rubric, I knew who needed assistance. They used an index card as like an exit ticket to identify what they needed to, what they wanted to work on. And then we had a subsequent PD last week. And then I worked with those teachers that needed a little more remediation with differentiated instruction primarily.
Excellent. And how many teachers do you have?
I think it was like, maybe like 13, 12, 13. It was a small group.
Yeah, no, that's great. So the biggest challenges then is that, well, it sounds like a couple of things, aligning everything that goes together, and then assessment, how you work on that. Let's see if anybody had also those issues. So thank you for sharing. Anybody else?
No. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. My name is Carlos Munoz, and I am in Isleta next to Liz Moya.
Oh, nice.
Hello. My lesson plan was delivered in a ESL for professionals, and there were, I think, 9 or 10 students.
Mm-hmm.
The essential question I used was how to speak with their supervisors,
Mm-hmm.
Relating to requesting time off.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so real quickly, I began by putting Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 on the board, and I gave examples of vocabulary of Tier 1, 2, and 3, and the students were really drawn to Tier 3 vocabulary because it's
Wow.
in fact, they were offering vocabulary from their profession.
Mm-hmm.
So another thing that worked well, besides them being drawn to their professional language, was that I had tons of time to deliver this lesson plan. Tons of time.
Tons of time.
I didn't think that that was going to be something that's going to happen throughout when we start the lesson planning. However, I started already lesson planning with a backwards design, and it's kicking in. I like it, and it's starting to kick in. I did have trouble with the assessment, especially the rubric.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't quite understand how to make a rubric. I made a mental rubric, and I was explaining to Liz Moya how it worked, and she said, I kind of think that there is a rubric there, but we need a graphic design rubric that she helped me to make, but I wasn't quite ready to use it, so I did not deliver a rubric.
Okay.
And the assessment part, the ELPS standards, I'm still having trouble with that part. Liz Moya keeps explaining me, but I'm not learning it yet. See?
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah, those actually, and like I think it was Dr. Langman, Dr. Lindell explained, it will take time, especially because they don't communicate with a TELPAS and they don't communicate with the ELA standards either. So it will take time and it will take practice. So hopefully with time and practice it will come. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else?
One quick thing though, I might add that in the activities there was conversations that were being created. However, my students had trouble speaking on the spot. They were relying a lot on their notes to do those conversations. Okay.
So basically, spontaneous conversation did not happen, right?
It was hard, yes.
Mm-hmm. And that's good. I'm writing it down so I can talk a little bit about it. Thank you, Carlos.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? Let's do somebody else. One more person. Oh, somebody wrote something. Lisa said, students were engaged in all parts of the lesson. We had trouble with searching the web because of school district controls. This frustrated us and the students. Also, some sites had just too much information for the student to read through. Next time, we would have a list for the students to choose from. So here it seems that students were actually interested in the lesson plan, and it seems that the issue was it was too much input, right? And also, I'm gonna write here the input, and also how maybe the plan, what students had to do in the website needed a little bit more planning. Otherwise, they will have a lot to choose from. But one thing that I'm glad that Lisa pointed out is sometimes the places in which we teach will have restrictions on the internet and what is it that we can do or cannot do with our students. I've worked in places where even though students bring their own devices, the place where we are doesn't have any Wi-Fi, so if students don't have their own data, they can't participate, and sometimes they even block internet access in the building. So that's something that we have to consider when we plan lessons that have technology. Thank you, Lisa. Okay, so a lot of you saw that Well, there were many things that did work on the lesson plan, and it was a little bit challenging because it's another way to build lesson plans that go with the standards. And why is it important to follow certain standards? Some people get basically put up because they think that standards restrict creativity. They say, well, they're not going to let me do what I want or what I think my students need. I know my students best. Why should I go with the standard? And the main reason why standards are necessary is just to streamline what we teach, right? Where we need to know, we need to make sure that students who are cataloged or considered a certain level, we know will have to know a certain amount of skills or vocabulary. That is not yet set in stone. There is some leeway, but if the students were to move from one place to another, there will be a more consistent way for the student to say, well, I'm at this level 1 and this is what it means, right? So that's why it's important. And now, in the discussions that I got from all the students that turned in their homework, thank you for the 14 students that did. I don't have the list right with me, but 14 students, and I received one just, this morning. The positive things that I saw, that all of you did a good job, where the planning, I could see that you guys were really looking at those standards, were really looking at the benchmarks, language objectives, and then you were connecting the activities to those standards. The objectives, you did a good job writing them. For the most part, they're there, right? Many times we go into the classroom thinking, I want to teach these, but we don't really have a clear objective. But all of you showed some clarity on the lesson plan. And then the sequences, I really saw that you worked on the sequences of activities where one activity will lead to the other, which is exactly what we need. We need that scaffolding. Now, on the parts that, and Helen shared that she had a similar problem when the students used the internet, and and then she also had problems with the rubric. And don't worry, we'll talk about the rubrics in a little bit. So what is some things that you guys said in your reflections, right, that you had trouble with? And one of the things that came up over and over was time frames. And there is no way for me to ask you to raise your hand if this was the point, but it was a lot of people said, I'm going to do this activity for 10 minutes. And it turned out that you needed 15 or 20 minutes. Or like Carlos was saying, students were so engaged into an activity, and Rosa also said that she did too, and that students would just go on and you cannot move on, right? The other thing that you guys said that did not happen, that you struggle with and that you would change, is that dialogue and communication. I think either Liz or Carlos said that for them it was the spontaneous communication. That was not only your issue, Carlos, it was a lot of your classmates as well, where the students feel comfortable if we give them maybe a dialogue, or they're within the confines of the activity, but once we want them to start playing with the language, it gets a little bit trickier. What I can say about this, it has to do with the activity, right? And what we basically push our students to do. So this is a common issue, I guess, and that we will need to talk about. And the last one was assessment, and we saw that Marcela Villarreal is trying to get in. She just sent an email that she can't, so maybe Glenda, if you have opportunity to check. So the assessment was another part, and this is the one that we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about, just because I don't want you to have the idea that for assessment you need to do a rubric for everything, and that you're not, you don't have to have like assessment to be so rigid, right? It's not like an exam. So I'm going to go over that a little bit. So this is an infographic of all of the, we put all of the reflections together, and this gives us an idea of the things that you talked about. You found Here we see, let me see, right here. This one. So we see that a lot of you found it very useful. Oh, I cannot paint here. Okay, you found it useful. The discussions was an issue. This one, differences, which was the biggest one. I think in this one, when I read all of your reflections, a lot of you were talking about the differences of activities, differences in students, the differences that you had, the differences in activities that you had to do depending on the level of your students. One thing that I really like to see, for example, confident, and then you wanted to do that mastery. So all of these are really, really positive feedback that you shared in your reflections. I did not see a single one where everything was horrible and fell apart. But one thing that, mostly that came up, but that was huge, was this time. So we'll talk about this in a minute. So what is the feedback that I have for you on that lesson plans? Well, let's start with the time limit. Actually, no, because it's not going to come at one. But, all right, so let's start with the time. It's right here. So for the time, I suggest that every time you have your activities, the best thing to do is test them before, especially if it's a new activity. Test it, and if it's a person who is already familiar with English, then add 3 to 5 minutes to it. The first time, give yourself time. Come prepared to do the whole class, right? But kind of also come prepared with the idea that you only are going to get to do the first 2 activities. Like the third one is just if we have time, right? And that way, if it takes you a little bit longer than what you wanted, you're not all stressed out that, oh my gosh, I have to get to that third activity to cover my objectives, right? So you will have to only cover your objectives on the first 2. And if the students do finish on time, then you move on to the next activity. So a lot of times, if we don't have specific language outcomes, that's when we kind of run out of time. So what I saw in your lesson plans is that you said, for example, and I'm not going to call any names, don't worry, I didn't memorize who did what, but there were some people doing informal and formal language, right? And they said, well, I want the students to differentiate formal and informal language. But if you don't say what exactly you're going to be looking at, that students are going to be able to use formally or informally, then you have no idea to assess, okay, can I move on? Can I give students more to do? And, and this objective is met. So if you're specific in saying, well, I want the students to learn the word however when writing a letter instead of but, or I want the students to avoid starting with and, for example, or to use one word instead of 2-word verbs, 2 of them, for example. So once you see that the student has already done that, you can say, okay, then we can move on, maybe give them 5 more words or not. If you have that level of specificity, or not specificity, but specific objectives and an idea of how many they have to do in order for you to move on, then you can limit those activities. You can say, well, I'm going to teach them how to start a letter in a formal and an informal way. Well, how much will that take you? Well, if the students know how to differentiate between to whom it may concern, or dear, sir, ma'am, or hello, then you can move on. And you know that activity won't take you very much. But if you say, well, I just want them to do a whole letter, well, that will not take you very, a short period of time. It's going to take you longer than that. So I would say design the activities following the benchmarks, right? That is something that I also saw, that when some of you said something didn't work, I went back and checked, well, what were your benchmarks? And many times what I saw was that you were not telling me exactly what the student was going to be able to do at the end of the lesson. And if you don't know exactly what the student will be able to do, then I was like, why is this here? Why you're taking too long in one activity or the other? So the other thing was the assessment, which I'm not going to take very long explaining here, but it's that if you did not have the specific outcome, if you don't have the benchmark, then the activity maybe took too long or too short, and then the assessment was not there. You basically said that you would check on the assessment that the students did it, but you didn't tell me what. And what that happens, if you don't do that on a regular basis, you really don't know how much the student is progressing. You're going to think, well, maybe you want to be more quantitatively, like you have to count all the time. It's just to give you a sense of where the students are. So because of that, we're going to think about these measurable outcomes. What is a measurable outcome that is going to help you with that assessment? So, okay, I'm going to move on. Are there any questions before I move on about these? I don't see anybody asking anything on the chat, and nobody. Okay, so we're going to do a quick review of writing objectives. In this, it's going to be a little bit more interactive activity. I'm going to go over the language objectives, and then I put some writing objectives that you guys sent me. Don't worry, I didn't put any names, and please, this is not about exposing anybody or making fun of everybody. So please do not be offended if you see your example there. It's just to help you come up with better objectives. So remember the formula that I want you to remember. Students will be able to, that's just, the phrase, but students be able to do what? By doing something, right? This by, it's very important. And this is something that I did not see a lot of you do. You had this part right here, the first part, like, for example, you told me students will be able to, recognize the difference between A and B. But you did not tell me how you're going to know that they recognized it. This will be what will give you that assessment. And this part will also be the one that will kind of dictate to you how much time you're going to allocate, right? For that activity. So for this first part, the one that you're going to say, well, what are they going to be able to do? We always encourage you to see Bloom's taxonomy. It will give you a list of verbs so that you know, okay, what are you going to have your students, do? A lot of people try to put that. Students will be able to know. Students will be able to learn. Problem with that is that we don't know when students know and learn. If I gave you a number, you might repeat it, right? But if I ask you that number, like a phone number, in 10 minutes, you will probably not remember. So what does learning mean? And I have a question. Oh, yeah. So, no, not that question. Sorry, it was for Wayne. So I really want you to think, if you want the students to know, do you want them to memorize? Do you just want them to recognize? Do you want them to label? Do you want them to point, like identify? Do you want them to describe? What is it that you exactly want them to do? And that will help you also develop these activities and know how long to put in these activities. It's not the same to say, oh, I want the students to use. Yeah, I want them to use, just like here, okay, by doing what? How are you going to know that the students are using? If you want them to identify, do you want them to identify the words by doing what? By pointing, by underlining, by repeating, right? So these are very important words, And what I saw in a lot of your lessons is that I want the students to be able, to, and then just know, or no other explanation. So, thank you for the version of the verbs there. So here are some of these examples that I want you to tell me whether these outcomes are written in a way that we know what the students are going to do. So let's start. All of them have number one. Well, let's do the first, number one. So the students will be able to communicate by answering questions relevant to their needs. So can anybody just tell me what you see with the first number one outcome? Is this written in a way that, helps us know what's going on to measure the outcome, or is it not? And how would you change it? So Lisa said, it is very broad. What kind of questions? And that's true, answering what kind of questions, because there are many types of questions. And Elizabeth says, I'm thinking, how will they communicate? Verbally, right? Or written? Gestures? There is so many ways to communicate. So we see that there is something problematic, that maybe when you're writing your lesson plan, it's clear to you. But I always tell my students when they write a lesson plan, think or write your lesson plan as if were you going to get sick and you needed a substitute teacher that day, right? If somebody else comes and reads what you're going to write, will they be able to deliver? If the answer is no, then we have to be more specific. Let's do the second number one. This is weird. This number two. Okay. The students will be able to convey brief messages by expressing how they feel when they're sick. What do we think of this one? And please feel free to speak up, or write. So they will be able to convey brief messages by expressing how they feel when they're sick.
So why wouldn't you start off with students will be able to express how they feel when they're sick by doing something else?
Yeah.
By writing or by speaking or something like that.
So be able to express how they feel by writing something about how they feel, or it's something that we can see them do, right? Writing a note, or by pointing at the feeling chart, or something more measurable, right? Elizabeth says, I guess this is when the rubric comes to measure brief and expressing how. Exactly. So what is a brief message? How brief is brief, and how do you express, right? Is that what you're saying, Elizabeth? Yeah. Okay. So we see that this one gives us a little bit more specificity than the first verse, right? But still we need to put a little bit more into what do we exactly want our students to be able to do, right? Let's look at the number, the third one, number 3. Student will be able to fill out a variety of forms, applications, and contracts for everyday life and work purposes by hand or electronically. What do we think of that one?
It's too general. It's a variety of forms doesn't really tell me that they have mastered any one particular form.
Exactly. So instead of saying a variety of forms, maybe we can choose one form, right? Be more specific. It's still very broad. You guys are right. Elizabeth and Carlos think it's still very broad. So forms, applications, and contracts are completely different types of forms, right? So are we going to focus on names on the form? So what is it? And the context is all over. So application for employment or application for an apartment, application, I don't know, to adopt a dog. I just had to go through one and it's completely different. So here, what we see is that we're not telling if somebody were to substitute for us, we really don't know. Imagine if I got this lesson plan and said, oh my gosh, by the end of this lesson, students will be able to fill out evaluatory forms by hand or electronically. Now, I did like the fact that it's by hand or electronically, right? But I think it could have been a lot more, there could be a lot more specificity, saying, okay, what kind of form and what for. So if you see, these ones are still parts of this lesson plan that I want you to work on, not because anybody's going to come and tell you, oh, you're a bad teacher if you don't do them. I mean, we all have these objectives in our heads. But it is better for us to know these things because it will help us with the planning, with the assessment, and like I said, if there is a need for substitute, somebody else can do that and achieve the same results. Also, the students will see how much they're learning. One thing that I like always to do, and I tell my students to do, I ask them at the end of the class, what did you learn today? And the goal is to basically get the students to repeat what we wrote this SWOT objective was. Oh, I learned to do X, very specific. That is a very highly motivating exercise for adults. Adults sometimes, they don't have time or they feel like they're not learning. But if you give them this, if you give them what I call a measurable outcome, they themselves get motivated by saying, oh, I learned this today. I learned this week, or I learned all of this week. It's motivation. It will get them engaged. And it's also accountability for their learning. So here I have some examples. I think I want to go a little bit. Yes, go ahead.
I had a question before we moved on. What if the buy is self-evident? So if you say student will be able to give directions orally to a place that they know how to get to, it's self-evident that they're going to give oral directions, and that you would know that they did or didn't. And then you would differentiate that out in your assessment of what you expect from a student at a particular level.
Yes, and that's right. When you have multi-level classes, of course, your objective is that the student will be able to give directions, right? By doing what? By telling somebody how to get to a place using public transportation, by telling them how to get to a place by reading the map, or how. There are many ways to do, to give directions. So here, the objective that I would like you to keep in mind for each one of the levels, because in this case you have 3 or 4 levels or whatever, is to be able to say, okay, what is the student, again, going to say at the end of the class that they learned how to do? Beginners could be differentiating right from left, or saying, I don't know, something like that. For a more advanced level, would be sequencing words, for example. So in this one, we get a little bit on the language objectives, right? Which is another thing that I saw that in your lesson plans, many people kind of avoided, or not avoided, didn't state it at the beginning. And you're right, you have that in the assessment. But if it's there, I wouldn't be picky because it's there. You thought about them. My problem was when I didn't see them anywhere in the lesson, where people only gave something very general, they didn't follow through. I still saw that, for example, for the assessment, it was like, oh, students were able to successfully give directions. I still don't know what that would mean. So in this sense, if you have to differentiate and then you give the specific objectives per level separately from the SWOT thing, it's all right. You still have them there. I don't think it would be okay if you didn't have them. Is that what you were asking?
Yes, I think that answered my question.
Yeah, so, and yeah, it's like to avoid redundancy, right? You don't want to put them in the objectives, and then you want to put them down there, and then you want to put them in the assessment. So I understand that. Of course, you can keep that general if later there is more specificity. But if there isn't, then I wouldn't. I would definitely want to see them there. Any other questions or comment? And if not, we can move. And then I have here some other exercises that you can do. And some of the, yeah, this lost the format. Some of the other examples from your lesson plans, right? If you are not sure what your students should be able to do or should be learning, I put a resource here, the toolkit, where you are able, we talked about, or somebody mentioned it during the face-to-face meeting, you can go into this resource, put the level that your students have, and even for those of you who have different levels, it will be good to get ideas of what your intermediate students are supposed to be doing as opposed to your beginner students. And it will give you ideas on what type of outcomes you want to look for. So now, tying the outcomes.
Let me just jump in real quick and let everybody know, if you're going to Taylor, Katarina and I will be doing a session on GSE at Taylor on the toolkit.
Excellent. Maybe I should attend. All right. And then, so how do we connect all of these to the rubrics? So now you're familiar with this form, and I really commend to the three of you who tried it. Good job. I saw that you tried to do the rubric and you tried to implement it. By the reflections, I saw that a lot of people had issues with the assessment part. How do you assess, and is it necessary? And in a 45 to 50-minute class, can we even assess our students in this way? What I want to point out is that this rubric is it's just a template for you to get used to seeing and making the rubric. Now, how you do it, it's going to be different depending on the level of the activity, and also whether, like, where you are. Is it at the end of the lesson, the end of the week? Are you going to do a assessment for a whole unit or what? So there are two types of assessment. Well, there are more, but like the two main ones, which is the formative and the summative assessment. The formative assessment is the one that we have to do ongoing. Basically, we're testing the waters. We're testing to see if our students have some mastery of what we want them to do so that we can move on. Sometimes we move on and the student did not really reach that objective that we wanted. But we have to move on because of time. So the idea with these type of assessments, the formative assessments, is just to know whether we need to keep sharing that content with the students, show it in a different way, teach it in a different way, and how much do they already know. It also helps us put the students in different levels. Maybe the student is not really or shouldn't be at the beginner level. I should be giving them content that is a little bit more challenging, right? So this rubric right now, of course, is 1 page long, but you can do the same thing by having 5 smiley faces. You know, when you get those surveys and it has like the smiley face and the frown face and everything in between, you can just have that. The thing is to know what is going to constitute the really smiley face and what is going to constitute that frown face that you're going to mark that assignment or that activity with. So I put this example, I saw this on a lesson plan, and the benchmark, we're gonna read these. Students will be able to identify the parts of the body. So here, identify the parts of the body by pointing to and identifying them orally. So pointing to, I imagining the body and identifying them. So here we see that it's very specific. We don't know here, and we don't need to put the parts of the body here because we have a place in our lesson plan where we put the vocabulary, right? And then another one will be to express discomfort by saying that something hurts. So the language objectives will be that the parts of the body, here I put which ones, later I saw some of which ones. I would encourage you to put which ones you're going to be discussing, because you're not going to do all of them. Then what is the grammar point that you're going to be covering? In this case, it was the third person singular, and then pronunciation, difference in these phonemes. So, for assessment, a quick way to do assessment to see whether the student has already achieved the objectives that we wanted is that, remember Dr. Langman told you to start with number 2, right? Just start here. Oh, that was horrible. To start here with a proficient, okay? What will a person, a proficient student that will meet the objectives look like? Who is going to meet the objectives? So anybody who names some points, targeted 5 body parts correctly. So maybe head, shoulder, knees, toes, and nose. I don't know, I'm thinking about the song. But those 5 correctly, and uses S for the third person singular, And then here's the distinction between the 2 sets of phonemes, and clearly pronounces or tries to pronounce the phoneme distinction. That's the person that is going to be proficient. They got it. We go to the second one. If somebody, you say, well, names, maybe, no more than 4 correctly, or names them but has trouble pointing correctly, then that person is a 1, is still there. Uses third person or use third person most of the time. Sometimes heard the distinction, but sometimes didn't. And pronounce phonemes the same way without clear attempt to make a distinction. And I put this here because we don't want to punish students for accents, right? If we know that they clearly demonstrate that they see the difference, they hear the difference, and they try to pronounce it, that's good enough, right? So somebody who's trying but not achieving or not all the time will be a number 1, right? And then we go to the more advanced level, right? The more advanced level, when, okay, maybe this person already knows more than 5 parts of the body. They use third person correctly all the time. Now, I will be here, most of the time, but actually knows the third person. Of course, they can make mistakes from time to time, but uses third person, at least in the lesson all the time, and heard them pronounce all phonemes distinctively all the time. And again, if we go back to accents, I would even say, or tries to, right? Because it's clear that the person understands that there is a difference. And then, of course, 0 is when the student is not doing it or hasn't achieved that. This one didn't really take that much to design. All it took is for you to know what will be the objective for the lesson. If the students already learned those 5 body parts, or those 2 phonemes, or 2 sets of phonemes, then it's the work, right? They did their job. They achieved the objective. And this will help you. Now, you can do this rubric, and most of you probably already do that rubric in your head, right? Like you already know, oh, well, this person already knows. But I would really, really encourage you to put it in writing, because then students, again, can keep track of their progress. Here's giving students a little bit more a window of, the outcomes that they are producing. If you notice, I put numbers in here because I can measure it. And this is a measurable outcome. I can see it. And it's not the number. It's just that I know what the result is. And this is what is called a measurable outcome. So I would be really happy if you could go back to your lessons and think, okay, do I have measurable outcomes? Again, if I ask my students at the end of the class, what did you learn today? Could you could you respond? Okay, Wayne, sorry, I didn't see your hand up, so go for it. Oh yeah, now I saw the hand.
That's okay. My question I had is, on your rubric, you have multiple objectives. So one of the issues that I have when I'm thinking about this is they know more than 5 body parts. Excellent. They've got a 3, but they only kind of sort of use the third person, and the pronunciation was so bad that if I didn't know what they were talking about, I wouldn't have been able to interpret. So is it okay to mix them like that, or would it be better off to have maybe like a 3-tiered so each objective is being measured independently?
I would say, and I'm sorry about my phone, I would say in this case, this was a rubric for the whole lesson, right? So in each activity, maybe the first activity will be dedicated to the body part. The second activity will be to the phonemes. So you can have this separate rubric, right? Then let me see if I can erase all of these. Yes, I can erase all of these. So this is what I would do when I used to teach ESL, because see, I'm all for practicality. And what I did, I actually would only do one rubric, like this one, right, for the end of the lesson. And sometimes if I know that I'm going to have 2 lessons on health, for example, I would say, okay, such and such has, maybe the student knows more than 5 parts, and they already, the ones that I wanted to teach, they're already there. And then maybe sometimes they heard the distinction, but it was not able to pronounce or did not attempt to pronounce. But this one, he uses correctly. So if you see, the student was all over the place because not all of the objectives were met. So you have 2 choices. Divide them and do a rubric for each one, or do something like that and know where the student stands. So when you go to the next lesson, well, you know that this student still needs work here, right? Oh, sorry, not here. Needs work here.
Perfect, that works.
And so what I would do, and I mean, this is just a system that you have to kind of like come up with. I would have the name of the student, and then I will have my lesson with all the objectives. And I actually did the smiley things that I was telling you about, because I knew what that would mean. And so I would keep a track at the end when I would do my summative assessment, because I will keep track of the student. I will say, well, you're still going to have to work on this and that. And I will have a one-on-one, maybe 5 minutes with each student, and say, this is what you did, this is what you learned, this is what you need to work on. And it was really good for the student because they knew what they had to work on. They were able to also take that ownership of their learning. So I would share that with the students, but I would keep it all in one so that you don't have the burden to do one rubric for everything, if that makes sense. Yes, so Carlos says that, 2 things. In a multi-level class, how do you do these 4 levels of criteria and to apply the student level? So to answer the first question, what I do on a multi-level class, personally, I know other people do this differently. I would put 2 more, what is it called? They're not levels, but two more numbers here. I would put 4 and 5. And then what I would do, if I share this with students, I would just divide it. For the advanced students, I will say this, and you're not supposed to be here. If you're here, then you go back to the previous level, right? For them, the 1 would be here, the 0 would be here. All of them will have to start here, and then 1 and 2. Of course, I would not share that. So that's what I would do with them. I would create more objectives for them, like language objectives. So instead of 5 parts of the body, for them it will be 10 and 15, etc. So instead of just third person, I will mix more things. So that's why this is kind of very practical. and it's just one and all. So it's not that the basic students, you're not gonna tell them you have to get all the way here. No. You are gonna be assessed down here, right? But your more proficient students are gonna be assessed up here and not down here, if that makes sense. And then the second question was, I know more is expected from the upper students. Oh yeah. So is this my criteria to assess? Yeah, like the criteria will be here. It's just that, again, how you assess, you're going to have to explain to students, this is what you get assessed on. Or you will know, I'm going to assess my students based on these 3 objectives and not these other 3. And I need to move on because we're running out of time. We started a little bit late. And basically, I'm done with this. So do not forget to write your measurable outcomes so that you can assess during rubrics. If you don't have a measurable outcome, then you really cannot say what the student is going to be able to do, right? If you say, oh, I want the students to understand, well, how are they going to understand? Understand by doing what? Or by pointing out or, finding the phone number correctly on a website, for example. So the person that said that had problems when going to website, it was too much input for students. If you had a measurable outcome, like students will be able to find the contact us page in one website. Oh, well, if the student was able to find it by clicking different home pages or whatever it is, you have a measurable outcome. That will really help you. And so these are examples of outcomes that I saw from your lesson plans. Some of you said, well, my assessment will be by listening and observing, but we don't know what, right? Students will demonstrate what they know. There is no how. Teacher will check the accuracy. So here it's a little bit more specific than the previous 2, but how, right? And give the students homework, have them check a bank statement. What do they need to check in that bank statement, right? So we always need a measurable outcome. How many aspects of or things about this bank statement will they need to know? And don't focus a lot on the number, but on what exactly is the student going to be able to do. So what are we going to do on the next workshop? The next workshop is going to be on how we can integrate math into the lesson plan, so math literacy. So the homework that I have for you is just to look at the lesson plans that you did. And don't redo them, don't worry. I just want you to go to your lesson plans, read them, read the objectives. If you can, please, rewrite the objective if you need it, rewrite the measurable outcomes, do one of these rubrics and share it. We can check it for you and give you feedback. But I want you to go and look for places where you can introduce a math concept or include math in one of your activities. And you can just highlight it, or you can just think about it and bring that in your next face-to-face session that is going to be on February 2nd. So right now, thank you for being here. It's already 3:01. I don't want to take more of your time. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And Glenda, I don't know if they can stay here for a little bit if they need to, or if they can just send us emails, or how you want to do this on the discussion board. So I guess nobody has any questions? And nobody has the hands raised. Nobody's. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. I will see you then all on February 2nd. If you can do the homework, that would be so great. And again, if you want to bring that rubric, please feel free to bring your rubrics so that we can check. Thank you. Have a nice weekend. Oh, and keep warm. The weather is about to turn for the worse. I hate the cold. Thanks. Bye. I'm reading the messages, sorry.